Hello and welcome to members and guests to this, our third quarantine special. This month we've got Mark Forsdike, known to many of you as Foz, who shares my passion for all things Suffolk Regiment. Foz is going to be talking to you about the 1st Battalion Suffolk Regiment during the North West Europe campaign in 1944 and 45. He's just written a book on the subject and there'll be full details of that at the end. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Foz Forsdike.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining me today. Today I'm going to give you a very short talk about the 1st Battalion Suffolk Regiment and the part they played in the North West Europe campaign. That's from D-Day to VE Day. It's not going to be a long talk, about 20 minutes hopefully, and what I'll do is I'll split it into 3 key areas. So I'll talk about the battles, the battalion, and later the legacy that they left behind. So going straight into the first part, really the story of the 1st Battalion in North West Europe starts at Dunkirk. In June 1941, Suffolk come home from the beaches and straight away they're sent to the West Country where they're reformed and re-equipped. But it's fair to say that the greatest thing that they lacked after having set foot back in the UK was the old soldiers, the old sweats, the time-served fellows who'd done time in India, time in Malta before the war. Their experience was bitterly felt. But within a few months they were brought back up to strength, all their vehicles were re-equipped, and then what starts is a series of postings around the UK on coastal duties, and then later up into Scotland to train in combined operations. Between Dunkirk and D-Day, one Suffolk mobilised just once. That was during the raid upon Dieppe when it was thought that the 3rd Division might have to bolster the Canadian forces, but luckily just as the fellows were getting ready the order was rescinded. Okay, so where the story starts to get interesting is up in Scotland. In late 1943 there's a complete restructure of the battalion. The battalion commander, the old battalion commander, moves on, and in his place a man who was to become a legend within the 3rd Division, Lieutenant Colonel Dick Goodwin, arrives, and he starts a root and branch clean out of all of the battalion. He makes sure everyone's fit, both physically and mentally, and that includes himself. And what they start to do is they train up in the Cromarty Firth, on the Moray Firth, and along the flat, straight beaches at Nairn, in combined operations. That's embarkation, disembarkation, loading, unloading, so that by the early part of 1944, they really are ready for a combined warfare, for a combined assault on occupied Europe. What happens also at the time, in early 1944, is that Dick Goodwin understands some of the key objectives that these men are going to have to take on the first day in battle. What he also learns is that 1 Suffolk aren't going to be the pincer battalion, they are going to be the senior battalion in their brigade, which means that they will land an hour after their 2 counterparts, and they will surge through them once they've made a bridgehead and forge on inland to capture other more important targets. And so, having moved south to Horndean, to their marshalling areas, after exercise Fabius in May, where they assault the beaches of Littlehampton and they work in cooperation with the Army, with the Navy and the Air Force, everything goes well, and so they're ready. They're ready for D-Day itself, that actual day, 6th of June 1944. They land at H+60, which is an hour after their counterparts in the East Yorks and the South Lancs have come ashore, and moving through them, their objectives are inland. Their first objective is to take the village of Colville-sur-Orne, which is now called Colville-Montgomery, and then from there they move out and they have to capture 2 positions, 1 gun position on the right flank, codenamed Morris, and a command post or a command bunker on the left flank known as Hillman. And Morris is taken quite easily with a minimum of casualties. In fact, just as they're about to put in an infantry assault, the occupants come out and surrender, put the white flags up, so that's quite a good start to the campaign. But where the tough nut to crack is over at Hillman, and Hillman takes a bit more thought. When Dick Goodwin arrives at Hillman, he realises from an on-the-spot appreciation that suddenly the position is far more heavily fortified than he'd been given credit for. Indeed, it becomes apparent pretty quick that most of the intelligence he's given in the UK is completely useless. There's also a thing to remember about Hillman, and that is that there was no cooperation between the naval bombardment and the ground troops, because the forward officer bombardment had been killed on the beaches in the opening waves, and that secondly, the aerial bombardment of the site, which was meant to have preceded the infantry attack in the early hours of D-Day, hadn't happened. It was quite considerably off target. So Dick Goodwin, with a company of 1 Suffolk, formulates a plan that will go through 2 barbed wire defences to an inner citadel, which has a series of slit trenches. He will take them on, and then he'll be fighting an infantry battle on the inside. It's a difficult nut to crack because all the time on his flanks he's got other battalions that are trying to get forward, particularly the Royal Norfolks on the left flank and the KSLI on the right. But it was a testament to his good planning and his skill, all of which was under fire, that eventually the complex was taken later that day on D-Day with a minimum of casualties. The following day the battalion's pulled out, it goes to Le Mesnil Wood, and it's here where on D+3 Dick Goodwin is wounded. Dick was in a carrier going from one position to another when he was caught fair and square by an 88. He was thrown out the carrier with massive wounds to the shoulder and to the side of the head. The intelligence officer who was behind him was killed, as was the wireless operator. So moving from there, they then come to their biggest battle of the entire campaign, the attack to take the Chteau de Hollande, which was the 28th of June 1944. It's the most costly battle in terms of men in the entire campaign. It's 163 men killed, wounded and missing. And we always forget about the missing, but actually there was 11 men missing in the battle, most of which were later, thankfully, found to be prisoners of war. But it was a really, really costly battle. It was high-pitched, it was concentrated, it was mingling of companies, it was the use of a creeping barrage, which went faster than the infantry could keep with it. There was confusion on site. It didn't help that the enemy had got several dug-in tanks and several unserviceable half-tracks that they'd turned into mobile bunker positions. But by the end of the day, the position has been taken, but it's been costly. After the Chteau, the battalion is pulled back out and it goes across the Orne in early July to take part in the infantry parts of Operation Goodwin. Goodwin has been seen as primarily an armoured battle, but there was a larger infantry element to it as well. What did happen there was that the aerial bombardment that preceded it did its job incredibly effectively, so that when the battalion advanced from Trône towards Sanneville and then on to Banneville afterwards, actually all of the landscape had been pretty much churned up. So the battalion was really involved in an occupation. It was more going in, finding a decent place to dig in, and then making a defensive line through the village. The weather gets a bit worse at the end of July and it turns into a bit of a quagmire, and then men start to go down with all sorts of weird and wonderful diseases. The mosquitoes in the River Valley are the biggest problem. But then from there they're pulled out of line and they get to spend Minden Day in a rest camp over near Bayeux. Minden, which is celebrated annually on the 1st of August, is the Suffolk's principal battle honour from 1759. And luckily a Suffolk officer was running a rest camp and he arranged with the commander of 8th Brigade to ensure that the battalion could spend Minden Day in his camp. But as with all things in warfare, by the end of the day they're back in the front line in new positions south of Caumont. And from here they begin their next assault, which is a series of leapfrog actions down the road from Veere to Tinchbury and then onwards ultimately to Fleur. The idea within 3 Div, which was in cooperation with the Americans on the right flank, was it was a series of leapfrogs. So one battalion would move to an arranged position, it would halt, then the other battalion would come through it, it would halt, and it would move on so far down the road. The main attack, which took place on the 13th of August, started at midnight. The first stage went well with the South Lancs reaching their objective, but then after that in the darkness there came confusion. As the Suffolks came through them, they realised that actually there was a lot of concealed enemy, particularly in the hedgerows. This was bocage country, so tiny little fields, enclosures, well dug in enemy, and it was pointless to fight them in the dark. So they pulled back, and then the following morning after an artillery assault they carry on and they go from there. And eventually, after 48 hours of really serious fighting, during which time at least 2 companies are almost reduced to 1/10 of their strength, the battalion reaches its objective, a stop line just north of Tinchbury. From there it was quite clear that the losses that incurred both at Tinchbury and at the Chteau de Hollande couldn't be replaced, and it's at that time in the Normandy campaign where all of the British Army is struggling for reinforcements, and that's why at the tail end of August what you get is a lot of reinforcements that come from the 59th Staffordshire Division, which has been broken up in France. So 1 Suffolk gets a lot of men from the 7th Royal Norfolks, the 2nd 6th South Staffs. And for the last few weeks of August, what they're doing is training. They're training in a little village called Chapeau-le-Moyne, and they're starting to learn cooperation with tanks, and they're using a lot of bridging apparatus for crossing rivers, crossing fords, because what's anticipated next is a large river crossing. It's anticipated that the Seine has got to be crossed, probably in the north, somewhere around Rouen. But more importantly, the battle is now moving at such a pace after the closure of the Falaise Gap that the British Army is going north at quite speed into Belgium. So after training, they then are sent by truck. It's one of the very few times in the entire campaign that they don't have to march anywhere. They get put into trucks, sent back via the Normandy beaches, up over the Seine to Les Andelys, and they spend a week there continuing their training just outside the ruins of Richard the Lionheart's castle. And then in the early part of September, they cross over up into Belgium to a little town called Soignies. And from there, they're brought back up to strength. They receive a lot of new officers. And then on the 20th of September, it's the crossing of the Esco Canal. So again, just as it was on D-Day, it wasn't going to be one Suffolk who were making the initial advance. It would be other units. In this case, it was in 9 Brigade. So it was the King's Own Scots Borderers and the Lincolns. They would forge the initial bridgehead that would then allow one Suffolk to pass over the canal and head for the town of Arkle. In fact, what happened was that it was a tougher nut to crack, and the Germans' resistance had started to stiffen. So every time that a pontoon bridge was put up over the canal, the Germans seemed to have an uncanny knack of knocking it down, which meant that another one had to be put up, and it delayed the advance considerably. The East Yorks as well had terrible trouble to a wood on the left-hand flank, which meant that they'd been fighting pretty much all night. So by the time that daylight came on the 20th, one Suffolk had to bypass their positions and head not for Arkle, but instead head for the town of Hamel. So they took a beeline to the east, managed to get the railway line, and by the time that they got to the railway line, the mayor had turned up with all his entourage, the leader of the local resistance, and they were warmly greeted. And it was really the first major town that had fallen to the battalion. And 2 days later, they have a similar experience when they cross over the Dutch border into Weert. Weert was liberated on the 22nd of September, and from there the battalion stay in entrenched positions around the canal to the northeast of the town for some days. They do press out towards Marhays, and they link up with the Americans. But this is the time of Operation Market Garden, and what suddenly becomes apparent with the failure of Operation Market Garden is that there's two large pockets of German resistance in the east and the west, and in the middle, Friedrich have got to push a bit further forward and make sure the Germans don't close the gap in the middle. So they go to a small place called Ripswood. Ripswood was a big battle for C Company of 1 Suffolk. It took some pretty ferocious casualties. It's not often heard of, but again, it was a time where great gallantry was shown. And from there, they then move over onto the right towards the two Dutch towns of Overloon and Venray. The task to capture Overloon and Venray had been given to an American armoured division, but it had taken them 3 weeks in a bitter slogging match to get to within a mile of the town, and they couldn't get any further. So the job fell to the 3rd Infantry Division. The attack at Overloon was interesting in that rather than attacking north-east or south-west as it had done in the past, it was almost attacking virtually south from the positions it started at. So it was an infantry assault, but the land was not good. It had been terrible weather in the week before, so the ground, which was your typical Dutch flooded pastures, was impassable to tanks and armour, which are what you absolutely need when crossing those flat, featureless fields, coupled with the fact that the weather was awful, which meant that very limited, if not minimal, air power could be brought in to assist you. And as always, as found in the campaign, that the moment one starts going, most of the wireless communications break down because of the damp. 1 Suffolk actually have a real battering, particularly A Company at Overloon. They attacked towards, their objective was a brick factory on the southern side of the town. They made little progress because of a German sniper in a wrecked windmill on the road to Oplo, which was basically a halfway point in the battle. And the German sniper was pretty good at his trade. He managed to take out the company commander, 2 platoon commanders, and wounded at least 10 or 15 men before he was finally silenced. But what it did do is it showed gallantry, it showed senior NCOs coming forward, commanding platoons, pushing men forward to the final objectives. The same can be said of the battle for Venray 4 days later. Again, the terrain was pretty much the same, but this time it was made worse by the fact that the battalion had to cross a natural obstacle called the Molenbeek. Now this was a small tributary in peacetime, but the Germans had managed to flood it to over 15 foot wide, and they've been very careful in mining the banks as well. So to get a company across and form a bridgehead on the other side was no mean feat, particularly when no armour could come up and support you because the land was unsuitable for them. However, by the end of the day, the battalion has crossed and it's heading to the village of Hiep, which is on the outskirts of Venray. The following day, they then pushed the Germans back to the south, for a large, heavily wooded area, and then they're pulled out of there into brigade reserve for the best part, for the remainder of October. November for 1 Suffolk was pretty uneventful. It was cold, it was miserable. Along the River Maas in northern Holland, there wasn't much to do except active patrolling. What comes at the end of the month is the attack on the castle at Geisteren. It was an unusual attack in that the ruins of a castle were on the edge of the river, and the Germans had used it as an observation post. And the idea was that the battalion were going to evict the Germans and get them back across the Maas. Then there would be no Germans on the eastern or the western bank of the Maas before Christmas. As with all things, the idea was a river assault, and they'd trained for that before at the tail end of the Normandy campaign with collapsible boats. The men were pretty keyed up, but just as they were about to attack, a massive hailstorm arrives, which prevents anyone going anywhere. It also prevents any form of air cover. And so the battalion has to withdraw. They have to wait until better weather, which comes a couple of days later, and then they go in for a second attack. And unfortunately, in the second attack, it's all a bit of an anticlimax, because when they get to the castle, they find the Germans have left. They've retreated over the river in canoes, leaving just the wreckage that's left. So up until Christmas, the battalion are there, they're holding the line. It's pretty miserable. The snow starts to fall around the 15th of December, and it really is a miserable time. But the idea of the 3rd Division was to keep the Germans occupied in that area, because the Germans were obviously making their large attack in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. The new year starts with a bit of a high note. With cooperation with the Americans, they make a big attack on what's known as Wonson Wood or Ferry Wood, and it really is a good success. It's the first time that the battalion have trained with armoured personnel carriers, and the Canadians that drove them were all full of praise at the time. The wood was captured, minimal casualties, and it finally meant that all the Germans had been evicted off the west bank of the Maas. Towards the end of January, the battalion's pulled out and it spends a fortnight in the Belgian town of Haak. And it really is to let it rest, to get it ready for the next major assault that's going to come, which obviously is the crossing of the Rhine. But as the early days of February go by, it's quite clear that the 3rd Division are not going to be involved in the Rhine crossing, and it's going to be given to others, because again, like the battalion on the first morning of D-Day, their objectives will be further into Germany. And what they start to do, more importantly, is they start to train in street fighting, because it's becoming apparent that when they fight in Germany, there's going to be lots of house-to-house clearance, there's going to be a lot of fighting, and it's going to be tough. The Germans have already started to stiffen in the first weeks of February. The attack in the Reichswald has shown that. And so the training in Haak is really to get the battalion acclimatised to the battle that they're going to have to fight in Germany, on German soil. The first major attack in Germany comes on the 28th of February when they attack through the woods at Gok. It's a battle that's largely unknown, although in some respects it was quite easy for the battalion. They took a series of objectives in the wood, which then allowed others to press through. By the end of the first day, it was clear that their counterparts in the brigade, particularly the East Yorks, who'd taken a real pounding at Schadenhof Farm in the south, couldn't go on and take their further objectives. So the following day, the 28th of February, 1 Suffolk go forward and end up taking responsibility of all of the brigade's objectives. From there, they're pulled out and they go across into Germany and spend some time along the River Ries, between sort of Kalkar and Xanten. Mainly their role for that sort of month before the Rhine crossing is to clear civilians away, clear civilians out of the area, make sure that all the roads, all the vulnerable points are secure, so that those stocks and supplies can be built up, ready for that big last good heave, as it was called. When the Rhine crossing comes, the battalion are waiting anxiously to cross, and it takes some days, it takes almost a week in fact, and then finally on the 28th of March they get their chance and they cross over and they end up taking new positions on the other side, close to the town of Halden. Then it's a curious period of limbo really, because the battlefront slows down in their sector and it becomes quite clear that elsewhere they're making wild advances. The 3rd Infantry Division reconnaissance had been reported in Munster, but where 1 Suffolk were, which was close to the battlefront at Lingen, nothing much was happening. And so at the last moment it was decided that they would switch the Free Div from one front and move them over to 30 Corps front for the final assault on Bremen. So from there's a lightning dash up the Dutch border. They take out the towns of Hengelo, Oldenzaal, Enschede, And so by the second week of April, they're sitting ready to go for the final attack on Bremen. And again, it was a series of leapfrogs, a leapfrog that went up the main road to take an objective, stop, another element would move forward and carry on. But this was really the fanatical last fighting that the battalion sort of encountered in the campaign. At Hallen-Seckenhausen, it took 3 days to dislodge the enemy. It was a simple, typical German street with 2 roads coming to a crossroads. The crossroads had to be taken so that other units of 185 Brigade could move forward into Brinkum and onto Bremen. And it was a pretty tough nut to crack. It was later established that they were fighting against SS officer cadets who, fanatical to the last, the only way they could get rid of them was to use flamethrowers. But the use of that armoured support and training with those armoured troops earlier in the campaign paid off, because 7th Royal Tank Regiment was able to come along, clear the Germans out and push forward away into Bremen. And really, that is the end of the fighting war for 1 Suffolk, because by the time they get to the outskirts of Bremen on the 2nd, 3rd of May 1945, the war has fizzled out for them. They're literally just house-to-house clearances. They're given an allotted area to the west of the city, a little village called Rabelinghausen, and by the time they get there, the Germans are already packing in and they're all too keen to surrender. And so the ultimate end of the war, which you would think would be VE Day, actually the battalion has already gone. It's already been pulled out of the battlefront at Bremen, and it's already over 60 miles away in a tiny little town called Bramsch. And there, overnight, it's gone from the role of fighting soldier to peacekeeper, and it's keeping apart all the warring persons who are coming home or trying to come home in Europe. And it remains there for a couple of months. It's the crucial time where everyone's voting. The general election has to be sorted. And then after that, it gets its posting orders to go to Belgium. And Belgium really is training for what the 3rd Division perceived would be the attack on Japan. It was always thought that the foot sloggers of Northwest Europe, the old Iron Division, would be the first to attack Japan, because Japan showed no real resolve in defeat. But then luckily, with the dropping of the atomic bomb, that really comes to an end. And so I suppose the story at the end of the first part here is the battalion leaving Belgium, ready to go to Toulon in the south of France, ready for their next posting, which is in Palestine. So in the second part, I'd like to talk about the battalion itself. I'll start with its commanders, because it's fair to say that 1 Suffolk actually, without being unbiased, had pretty good commanders throughout the campaign. The first man, as we've touched on previously, was Lieutenant Colonel Dick Goodwin. Dick arrives in 1943 when the battalion are up in Scotland, and he really is a breath of fresh air. What he does is to start that root and branch clear out, get rid of all of the older, more inexperienced, perhaps not medically up to the grade officers, and he puts a new command structure in. He puts new, younger subalterns in, the same sort of years of soldiering as himself, men such as Philip Papillon, who's killed later on in the campaign, but he's been a contemporary of Dick Goodwin's, joining the battalion roughly the same time in India. Dick really is a soldier's soldier. What he understands is the men, he understands their limitations, and more importantly, he realises well that he wouldn't ask them to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. So that's why he starts on a complete campaign of making everyone fit. And that was from the battalion commander right down to the lowly clerk. If you didn't meet the grade, you weren't there. Dick, as we said, was wounded on D+3 at Le Mesnil Wood, and in his place the second in command takes over. His second in command was Lieutenant Colonel Kit Goff. Kit had been an officer of the Lincolnshires, and again he'd been a pre-war regular soldier. He'd served with them in China, in India, and he'd been with the battalion for almost 2 years, and so he knew as well the men involved, their limitations, and what was expected of them. Kit had a great sense of loyalty to the Suffolks, and he was always described as a true Suffolk, even though he wasn't one. And indeed that's shown particularly at the time of Tinchbury when he's wounded. He's wounded just before the attack on Tinchbury is due to start, but rather than go to the advanced dressing station, he insists on being taken back, bleeding on his stretcher on the back of his jeep, to tell his second in command, Major Freddie Allen, the orders for the day, and to make sure that he's prepared for the attack that's coming. Major Freddie Allen, who took over from Kit Goff, was a bit of a legend in his own mind. He was a pretty impressive character. It was always said that he really should have commanded the battalion, but unfortunately what Freddie got was the jobs in between other commanders being wounded. Freddie commanded it at two of its most crucial times, the attack on Chteau and later in Holland when Richard Craddock, who was another battalion commander who we'll talk about in a minute, was wounded at Venray. Freddie Allen commanded the battalion all the way through into Belgium until a new battalion commander arrived, which was Lieutenant Colonel Richard Craddock. He'd come from the Buffs. He was also pre-war regular officer. He, just as Dick Goodwin, leading from the front, was wounded when he trod on a shoe mine at Venray on the 16th of December. And again, Freddie Allen was pushed into the void. So Freddie Allen ended up commanding the battalion until the new battalion commander arrived. And it was a cruel fortune of war that Freddie Allen was promoted Lieutenant Colonel in the early part of November, and he was given command of the battalion for just 7 days. And then after that, Lieutenant Colonel Dick Goodwin is pronounced well, and he comes back to join the battalion, and he ends up commanding it all the way through to VE Day. It's a shame because really it should have been Freddie's battalion, but it shows something of the man of Lieutenant Colonel Dick Goodwin, that actually having started the campaign with him, he wanted to finish the campaign with them, even though his wounds weren't properly healed, and for years later, the problems that he had with his shoulder made saluting difficult. But Freddie Allen didn't suffer. He went on to command a battalion of the East Lancashires in 53rd Division, and he ends up winning a DSO and a bar by the end of the campaign. So the command structure of 1 Suffolk is paramount and is crucial to the success of the battalion. Coupled with that, it's the men underneath. The men are really the strength of the battalion, and it's the leadership of the senior and the lower grades of officers, the junior officers, that shows through later in the campaign. In the early days in Normandy, there was high casualties amongst officers, but later those lessons were learnt, particularly the lessons of the Chteau and Chteau, which meant that come Holland, there was a far lower rate of officer casualties, and also the battalion was succeeding. It was quite often succeeding where others had failed, and that is part of the reputation that they gained in Northwest Europe of getting the job done. It always seemed that where others failed, 1 Suffolk were forced in to fill the gap and to succeed. That was certainly the case at Overloon, it was certainly the case at Gok, and later on at Halland-Seckenhausen, where that key objective had to be taken for others to advance on Bremen, they had to do it as well. And it's a testament to the command structure that they did. The other part of the Suffolk Regiment is obviously the fighting soldier, and it's the family spirit of the Suffolk Regiment that seems to win out through all of this. No matter when he served or wherever he served, the Suffolk soldier, even if he wasn't Suffolk born and bred, always seems to be a unique fighting man. And it seems that Dick Goodwin very, very aptly said that he had staunchness to a Merck degree, he was impervious to pain or discomfort, he was a little slow, but that didn't matter when he had all the other qualities. And that was so true of the fighting Suffolk that he just got on, put his head down and did it. And it was that feeling, I think, of comradeship, of looking after your friends, that meant more to you than your medals. And I think because of that, that's why the battalion has the lowest number of gallantry awards of the 9 fighting battalions of the 3rd Division. When you look at it, others who had been in combat for less time were given or were awarded more, but I think it goes part to the psyche of the mindset of the Suffolk soldier, that they didn't chase gallantry, they weren't interested. Doing the job was enough for them. Knowing they'd played their part was more important to them than medals. And I think that shows out by the fact that there's only 2 DCMs and 10 MMs in the entire campaign. The recognition was minimal at the time, and that's part of the problem, that they've been invisible to the history books for so long. The reason for that is also that they were quite often away fighting when the reporters came. So a reporter would turn up looking to get a story, and 1 Suffolk were in the front line along the River Mars fighting, so the reporter would go and find someone else to do a story about. And that's why today, when you're looking for them in period newspapers, you find very little about them. So in the final part, we're going to talk about the legacy, and for the regimental historian seeking more info on the battalion and its actions in the campaign, there really is pitifully small amounts that can be found. Apart from 2 books that were written in the 1980s and the 1990s about their part in the Normandy campaign, really there is very little else. And that invisibility from history has started a long while ago. In fact, it starts all the way back in the 1950s. It's also fair to say that the battalion were quite badly tainted in the final years of their existence by some of the accusations that were levelled against them, and particularly levelled against their commander Dick Goodwin, about his hesitant action to take Hillman on the first day of D-Day. That invisibility seems to have continued, and so now, today, when you pick up a book on the Normandy campaign or on North West Europe, you find but the fewest of words. And really that's part of what I tried to do writing the book, was to give a bit of a warts and all factual history to a new generation of people looking. And luckily, the legacy that the old boys set down, particularly from the ranks of the old Comrades Association, was really, really good. The Suffolk Regiment, as far back as the 1950s, its officers from the North West Europe campaign were meeting, but it wasn't until the 1980s that the first real big pilgrimages started to go back to their former battlefields in Normandy. It was a couple of retired officers and a senior NCO who'd been on his own holiday 2 or 3 years before, who'd written an itinerary. And so in 1984, there's over 50 Suffolk veterans and their wives go back. And really what that starts to do for men who are newly retired is it starts to trigger things in the old grey matter, and they start to write down their accounts. And so through the 90s, we have some really, really good, strong accounts that were published in the regimental newsletter, but nowhere else. And so pulling those together with some of the surviving veterans that we've got now was really the ultimate aim of this book, to provide that balanced history across all of the campaign. As always with this stuff, there's periods where you can't cover. No one seems to remember Gok, and no one seems to remember the time they spent on the winter in the Mars. But there's lots of really good accounts of Normandy, of Tinchebray, particularly of the Chteau d'Arlon. The Chteau, the biggest battle, was very heavily written up by a lot of old boys in the 80s and the 90s. And so it's good to be able to bring those accounts out and put them back. The aim of writing the book was really to finally give them some credit for their actions. The old boys now, the living face of the regiment, is gradually fading. I've been privileged to know them for well over 20 years, and some of my contemporaries even longer. And to hear those accounts and be fascinated by them has been the ultimate aim and the reason for doing this book. I hope it will show that the reputation they gained in North West Europe was strengthened later on in the post-war years, particularly in the campaigns where they'd fought in Malaya and later in Cyprus. But it's the North West Europe campaign that cements that reputation that has been carried on by the Suffolk Regiment till amalgamation and by its successors to this day. The Suffolk Regiment had an ancient motto on its colours called Stabilis, which was borne upon them at the time of Minden. It means steady. And never more so was it exemplified as in North West Europe. Fellas who got on, did the job, didn't worry about the fuss or the bother, and just carried on and went back to civilian life at the end of it, thinking nothing more about it. The book is, in some ways, my appreciation of their efforts all those years ago, and I hope that it will go some way to reversing that trend of invisibility from history and give them the credit they deserve, which is, in my opinion, long, long overdue. Thank you very much.
Mark's new book, Fighting Through to Hitler's Germany, is available directly from the publishers, Pen and Sword Limited, online. Thank you all very much indeed for watching, and we'll see you all next month.